This interview is made possible by the work of Catholic Charities of the Diocese of Arlington, which is funded in part by the Bishop's Lenten Appeal. We thank all who support this critical appeal and the ministries it funds. You're listening to Searching for More, a podcast of the Diocese of Arlington. On this episode, gender identity. It's the ideological perspective that gender is fluid and not biologically linked. Find out why this is not true, and find out what parents can do when they're faced with a child experiencing gender confusion. This episode's host is Billy Atwell, Chief Communications Officer for the Diocese.
Dr. Moncher, thank you for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Billy.
So the issue of gender and gender identity, all of these things have been a pretty popular debate in culture, but it's also, we're seeing it bleed into politics a lot. Many were startled by it. Some were they didn't see this coming. Where did this conversation really begin? Because something tells me it's not as recent as we think.
That's right, yeah. I think it really began back in the 60s and when all issues of human sexuality were beginning to be debated, and we know there was a papal encyclical, Humanae Vitae, that spoke in on this. And shortly thereafter, the professional organizations in my profession, psychiatry and psychology, began looking at these issues and same-sex attraction, transgenderism, these sorts of things, all of a sudden, which had historically been considered to be conditions and issues of concern that needed treatment and intervention so people could be healed, were beginning to be celebrated and beginning to be normalized. And so the first wave of this was with the movement towards homosexuality being normalized, and we've seen that kind of progress through the decades to the place we are now with same-sex marriage being a part of what happens in our country. And transgenderism, I see that as sort of the natural outgrowth of what's happened after that. It's sort of the next wave of ways in which people are trying to look at the human person in a way that is very different than we would from a Christian anthropology, from an understanding of being made in the image of God, being made male or female.
What's the common thread between the issues that kind of connect them or make it a natural outgrowth?
I think it's this idea that there's a relativism to it, that there's no such thing as truth, there's no such thing as grounded reality. And so, as Christians, we believe that our body tells us something about ourselves and that has profound meaning to who we are. And these movements are very antithetical to that. They don't see the body as telling us who we are. And instead, what's telling us who we are our feelings. So in the case of homosexuality, it's how you feel about who you're attracted to that is carrying the day. And in transgenderism, it's kind of how you're feeling about whether you're feeling more male or female today.
As a clinical psychologist, what makes you interested in this topic, and how did you learn about it? Something tells me when you went to school, this wasn't like the topic on your mind, but it's one that's come in front of you. How have you learned about it, and what makes you interested in it?
Yeah, that's right. This wasn't a very common thing explored in my education for the very fact that it's a very rare sort of condition at its root. Now, what we're seeing in the current day is a huge upsurge in these sorts of reports of people experiencing themselves as the gender that they weren't born. But back in the 80s, when I was in my training, it was seen as very rare. 2 or 3 people out of 1,000, might be experiencing this as a bona fide kind of condition. And I did get some exposure to it actually in my training, just because there was a psychiatrist at the University of South Carolina Medical School, George Riekers, who was the expert at that time in this. And he was doing what most people, I think, would have seen as common sense sort of interventions, that if there was a young child who was born a male and was wanting to live as a female, the parents would bring him in, and the psychologists and the therapists would work with the family to help this child grow into his biological sex as an identity. And the research bears this out, that in about 80% of the cases, even without intervention, most children who experience themselves as something other than their birth gender will spontaneously or naturally, particularly with puberty, but even beyond that, end up identifying as their biological sex. And so it was a part of my training only in the sense that it was really on the periphery because it wasn't very common. More recently, what's happened with some of the changes you mentioned there at the beginning is that we've been getting increased numbers of referrals of people who are reporting to be transgender. Oftentimes it's the parents of the children who are coming to us in a Catholic setting saying, what do we do about this?
I've heard on the news about people who have taken their kids and gotten them hormone treatment. What happens with someone like that? Like you said, naturally, a lot of times once they hit puberty and beyond, they will start to align themselves mentally, I would guess, with the gender that they were born with. What happens to the children who are given these intensive hormone treatments and so on?
Right, that's a huge point of controversy in the field. And so there's an international organization that continues to drop the age at which they're recommending hormone treatments to begin. The problem with that
they're dropping the age to make it even younger. What's the norm now, or what are they saying?
I think they're saying around 14 is when they're recommending it could start. There's others who say even prepubescent. Let's stop puberty from happening. So it's a very contentious sort of thing. The problem with that, as you might imagine, is there are of the children who, 6, 8, 10 years old who are experiencing some of this gender confusion. The 80% of them that would naturally grow out of it are being prevented from growing out of it in part because they're being intervened with. And of course, many more of those children are staying with this gender confusion rather than growing out of it.
What is the long-term impact on someone like that psychologically?
Well, there's psychological and physical impacts. So the hormone suppression and treatments are stopping a natural process, and you can't stop a natural process without having some consequences to that. I'm not a physician, so I don't know all the details, but that literature is out there. Psychologically, what's happening is that there's a huge interference with identity formation at a broader level. And one of the things that I often talk about with this is that although a child may be expressing gender confusion at whatever age, they're also typically confused about their identity in many, many other ways as well. There are isolated individuals who are seeking belonging and trying to find their place in the world. And what's happened with the popularity of this, because of some of the things in the media, is children who in past years may have turned to drugs or alcohol or some other way of trying to find a group to fit in with. They're now saying, let me identify as this.
Most colleges and universities have a psychology program. It's a very common track that people can take. What is the average student learning nowadays? Is there kind of a commonality where most schools are teaching X, Y, or Z, or what are they teaching? Okay, yeah. What is that?
Yeah, so in a non-Christian, secular, typical public university, they're teaching what the professional organizations have been putting out, and this is part of what's been shifting over time. So back in the 80s and 90s, in the official diagnostic manual of the psychiatrist, what we're talking about here today would have been called gender identity disorder. So it would have been called a disorder. Disorders need to be healed. What happened back in 2013, and again further revisions in 2015, is it's now being called gender dysphoria in other labels where the problem is not seen as the person is identifying as something other than that which they were born. The problem is seen as they're distressed because their feelings aren't matching with their bodies. And so what's being taught in the schools is the treatment is no longer to realign someone with their biological sex. The treatment is to affirm them in whatever it is they're feeling in the moment.
What are they basing that on, though? I mean, is there new research that's telling them to go in that direction, or is it more? I mean, obviously the political whims. Politically, it's more popular to go with what you're saying. That's the model if you want to talk politics. But is there science supporting it? And if not, what science do you look to?
Yeah, there's actually no science that says that this is a pathway to happiness and well-being and flourishing. And so that's part of the tragedy of all this, is it's very much more of a cultural, social, even political movement that's driving this, that there's a segment of our society that is very much invested in, I think of it as dismantling the traditional family and traditional values. And this is another beachfront that can be transgressed in that way. The research I look to is often hard to find. Many of the professional journals won't publish research that's supportive of the traditional view of the human person. And so these journals only publish those that are affirming this kind of transitioning into a different gender. But there are studies out there, and the one I like to highlight is this longitudinal study from Sweden. And Sweden's an interesting place because it's a small country. They have a national database. Everyone's in the database. Everyone gets the health care. And so they have very, very good, reliable records about what's happened to people through the decades. And someone did a study where they talked about what happens to someone who transitions, who is experiencing gender dysphoria, goes through hormone treatments, goes through surgery. What happens to them over time? And what they found was that there's a short-term and long-term sort of situation. In the short term, they're finding that the people are expressing less distress, less depression, less anxiety, more contentment with life. When they followed them out 10 years, what they found is that the honeymoon phase, if you will, the uptick in their functioning disappeared, and things actually got dramatically worse.
Worse than before they had transitioned?
Right, or at least on par with. And so when they followed these people who had transitioned, they were 7 times more likely to have suicidal ideation, 19 times more likely to commit suicide, 4 times as many psychiatric hospitalizations. And it's interesting, the authors of the study were not necessarily advocating a Christian anthropology. And so they even cautioned to say the surgery didn't cause these increased problems, or the hormones didn't cause these increased problems. The implication there, of course, is that these problems pre-existed. That the most parsimonious way of understanding this is that these were troubled individuals who were distressed about their life, and they thought it would get better if they changed gender. They changed gender, and they had a little bit of relief because they thought they'd gotten what they wanted. And then over time, and 10 years is about the kind of benchmark, they realized that things hadn't really changed for them. What distressed them before was still distressing. And it was possibly that things were worse because what they thought was a solution wasn't, and where else do you turn? Right.
And now you had mentioned that it's a very rare condition, or at least it was, in the years when you talk about in Humanae Vitae, which was the 50th anniversary is July 2018. Were there enough people in that Swedish study to be kind of a good group that you would feel confident in the data of it?
Right. Well, the number of people who actually go through the surgery and the hormones is relatively small, just because of it's a radical thing, and many people might think they want to do it and then not actually follow through with it. But there was enough to make it a statistically reliable study. The other piece of it is Sweden is a very tolerant country when it comes to gender fluidity. So a lot of the arguments from the secular psychological perspective that the reason that people who are experiencing gender dysphoria are so upset is because they're bullied, discriminated against, and so on and so forth, that doesn't...
that wouldn't have been a factor in this
study.
Explain
it, in this study, because this is a place that was welcoming and celebrating this sort of phenomena.
This is an issue that a lot of parents are concerned about. And if a parent sees that their child is showing signs that they're struggling with their gender identity, what should the parent do, and how would they best talk to their child about it? Because obviously they want to come across compassionately. Obviously they want to be understanding. They don't want to damage their relationship with their child, but they also want to help their child. How do you suggest that they approach it?
Right. It's a little bit of walking a tightrope. So as you just said, the key is to continue to love the child, to accept them, to be with them, to stay engaged, to accompany them. That those are the basic human needs. If a child is beginning to feel this level of distress, my advice to parents is, first of all, don't panic, because particularly in this day and age, a part of that could just be a little bit of the contagion phenomena.
What do you mean by that?
Well, that there's friends or other kids at school who are saying this, and so they're sort of saying it too. So that it could be just sort of a part of a fad. And most kids are going to kind of move through that pretty quickly. If it is a little bit more of a constant thing, then it is a sign that the child is distressed. And so you do want to see, is there anxiety? Is there depression? Is there any sort of peer relationship problem that needs attention, and to get them help at that level? There are some family factors here. If you look at the research, the children who end up identifying as something other than their gender oftentimes have conflict or trouble with the same-sex parent or with same-sex peers. And so very much always looking at how do we improve relationships, not just with this child, but maybe throughout the family. And if parents can take that broader perspective that, it's not a hopeless, helpless situation, trust the data that 80% of these children will move through this, so you don't have to panic. But you do need to stay engaged. And you have to make difficult decisions. If the child says, I want you to call me by a name that you didn't name me, or a pronoun that isn't who I am, there's not any good evidence that that's helpful to do that. But again, it's a little bit of a tightrope. People are making compromises. Nicknames become invaluable. A lot of times there's a nickname that everyone can agree on, and it just works.
Is there a sign that it could be damaging? That there may be, I think parents that would resist it don't want to perpetuate the belief, but they also, like you said, don't want to alienate themselves from their child. You said that there's not signs that it helps. Mm-hmm. Is there a sign that it hurts to use it?
Yeah, I don't know from a research perspective if there's that kind of evidence, but I know anecdotally in the families I work with that it is a point of contention. And it's constant struggle where sometimes half the family will call the boy she and half the family will call the boy he. The conversations get very difficult to have because it's difficult to track. And I think that is likely to cause just division and problems in the family. And you do want to try to maintain some sort of unity wherever you can.
One thing that I've heard proponents of transgenderism and that would take the opposite position of yours is that sex and gender are different, that they're not the same thing. Yes, biologically they might be one, but their gender isn't necessarily the same, that there's something else. I always find that confusing because then it almost makes gender a totally irrelevant phrase. If it can mean anything, then it means nothing. So what is your response to that when you hear that objection that sex and gender can be torn apart and treated differently? What is your response to that?
I usually see if I can engage them in a conversation that would respect the idea that sex is a biological phenomena. It's, the vast majority of people are born with clearly identified sex down to the chromosomal level. It's not really something that's open to debate. Gender was introduced as a term not to replace sex, but it has taken on a lot of that weight. I think of gender as an adjective, not a noun, and that's maybe a better way of understanding. And so there are men who are more feminine, and there are women who are more masculine. And so there's gendered aspects to who we are. But the fundamental idea of who we are is not going to be described by the feeling we have of what our gender is.
I see. Okay. Very good. This is an issue that Catholics are struggling with, I think, because it's a tough issue, obviously, and because it's very hard for them to describe or defend. It seems obvious to a lot of folks, so that they struggle with it and they don't want to appear insensitive. What is the best way to assert, to defend, to explain the Church's position on gender identity, keeping in mind the context that they don't want to come across as a bigot or unloving? That obviously we love everybody. If someone's in this situation, we don't want to appear uncaring for them, but we don't have to go along with it. Like you had mentioned a minute ago, to accept the child, that wouldn't necessarily mean go along with everything that the child is saying and participate in this situation. How do they balance that tightrope? Not just, we talk about parents and children, but individuals with society and coworkers and who might disagree. How do they explain this and defend it?
Right. I think there's a couple points I would make. One is that when I'm engaging in a conversation with someone who comes up and says, I'm gay or I'm trans, as a sort of an introduction of themselves, I would like to steer the conversation very quickly to my respect for their dignity as a human person and say, I understand that's a part of what you want me to know about you, but I want you to know that I know you're much more than that. You're not limited to your sexual orientation or your feeling about your gender. That may be a part of your experience now, and I can accept that that's what you want to share with me, but I'm really curious to know everything else about you and to really try to treat them with more dignity in a certain way than they seem to be treating themselves. And so there's an element of reductionism. There's a way in which God's glory is full and big and magnificent, and things that are not a part of that are narrow and small. And so when someone narrows and smalls themselves, I think if you can do it respectfully and communicate that in love, you want to know more of them, not less of them. That sometimes can start a different kind of conversation. The other piece is to own up from the start that that as a Catholic Christian, you've got certain first principles, and people can call them biases, I suppose, but it's really a first principle that we believe that we were created by God in His image, and we were created male or female. And so everything that I'm going to say in our conversation is going to be with that first principle. And if you're willing to engage me with that, then let's have a long talk about this, because it is complicated. And you're seeking kind of love and affection and belonging, and I'm another human person, and you deserve that. I want to meet you where you are. But I need you to respect my first principle, because I can't pretend that that's not what I believe.
There would seem to be a need for mutual respect between the two, if they're going to have a dialogue about it rather than a fight or a debate.
Sure.
It also makes me think, when you said it's a form of reductionism to just talk about that when you're dealing with the individual, it's almost like when you see the street preachers who have the signs, repent of your sins or you're going to hell. You don't even know my name. And you're the first thing I'm getting is harassed about my sins, and I'm going to hell. It's not the way to convert. All good evangelization happens in relationship. It doesn't happen with distance. It's that intimacy. It's that knowledge of one another, that sincere appreciation, that you can actually have an impact on somebody. That I think that's really wonderful advice.
And the church wants these people in the kingdom.
Right.
Yeah, that's the truth of it. And you won't read that on many Google searches about this phenomenon. But that's the reality, is that the church's doors are wide open to having people who may be experiencing these sorts of things. But again, the church must be respected for what it teaches as well.
A question about just kind of our culture and society in general. The devil's advocate might say, just let people do what they want. It's their decision to live how they want, to have surgery or not have surgery. If they feel like they're one particular gender, let them live that out. How does that affect you? What's a maybe a big picture understanding of the problem with that thing?
Yeah, the sort of tongue-in-cheek response is we don't let people smoke in buildings anymore.
Yeah.
And it's that sort of phenomena where to be indifferent to this is really not to be loving and caring. And the research shows that people who are struggling in this way are suffering. And it's not loving or compassionate to let people do just what they want because they feel like doing it. There's many areas where we as a society say, no, we're not going to let that happen, because we have a duty for the common good to protect the members of society. And if we know something is a carcinogen, if we know something is dangerous, we step in and collectively decide to prevent it. And that's what would have happened, of course, 50 or 80 years ago. If there were someone in this situation, the response would have been loving, compassionate, but let's help you through this. Let's not celebrate it.
It also seems like, you had mentioned this emanating out of the general movement of homosexuality and gay marriage, and we saw very quickly the conversation was initially, let us do what we want, let us live however we want and love who we want. Then very quickly it's, and you're going to participate with this. Businesses, bakeries and so on were taken to court, and they lost everything because they wouldn't bake a cake for a gay wedding. So it does seem to quickly overstep a line of just kind of passive reluctance to get involved. Okay, we'll just let them do what they want. Well, very soon they come and expect you to participate in that. Where do you see things going from here in terms of the research as a clinical psychologist who's very involved in this and treating people with this? Where do you see it going from here in terms of public policy, the science, and just the practice of helping individuals in this situation?
Yeah, there's a lot of controversy with that, and it's concerning, really, at a professional level. So there are movements about legally to limit the practice of psychologists to help people in this situation, and at times prevent certain types of therapy that in the past have been shown to have some efficacy towards helping people, because the norm and the mandate seems to be quickly becoming that this must be affirmed. The progress with those sorts of efforts to change things has slowed a bit, but I think the pendulum may not have swung as far as it's going to swing. I'm always trusting that when we come to these sorts of phenomena, there's a cyclicalness to it, that there will be a swinging back. As soon as practitioners realize that they're not helping people, people of good faith and conscience will begin to think otherwise. There was a clinic up in Johns Hopkins that was very much doing a lot of this work for a long time, and some of the major figures of that institution have since reversed their stance on it, and realized that when they were trying to change the sex of children who may have had unfortunate surgeries at birth or these sorts of things, some of these cases ended very tragically, and they realized that we can't change a gender. The reality is, when you're born a male, you have an X and a Y chromosome, female 2 X's. No amount of surgery or hormones changes that. And there's a way in which that there's an enduring capacity for the body to know who it is, and that eventually shows out. So I think there is going to be eventually a pendulum swinging back. While that's going on, though, unfortunately, there's people who are pushing the envelope into other directions even further. And so there's individual cases where people are trying to become non-human. They're manipulating their body to become more robotic, and trying to take the humanity out of it all. And again, I think at the root of it is this idea that there's a segment of our society that doesn't want to celebrate the traditional family and the design that God has given us for what will create an environment where children can grow into flourishing human persons.
Sounds like a traditional family, the witness of a devout Catholic traditional family, could be a great antidote almost to some of this, when we're seeing maybe the damage that builds over time and the casualties, so to speak, of this whole kind of psychological process. The witness of a traditional family might be very powerful in combating that.
Right. I think for the average person who doesn't have sort of entree into maybe some of the more details of this, that's the best you can do. Certainly pray, live good lives, be a good witness.
Very good. Now, you write about a lot of topics. This is just one piece that we're introducing people to about what you study and practice. Where, if people wanted to read more of what you've written and so on, where would you recommend that they go?
I write for typically a group called the Culture of Life Foundation. So it's cultureoflife.org. You can find a lot of my material. Very
good. And for anyone interested in learning more about Catholic Charities and the various services that they provide and the great work that they do, please go to ccda.net. You can learn more about it there. Dr. Moncher, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to Searching for More. If you enjoyed this podcast, please write a review on iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Also, make sure you follow the Diocese and the Arlington Catholic Herald on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channels for regular videos that will inspire, educate, and inform you about the Catholic faith and our diocesan community.